Detective Frank Dawson had been working the graveyard shift for 18 years, but the call that came through dispatch at 2:47 a.m. on October 15th, would become the defining case of his career. The radio crackled with that particular urgency that makes even seasoned cops straighten up in their seats. Missing person report, 23-year-old female, last seen 48 hours prior. What began as a standard welfare check would spiral into one of the most chilling investigations our department had ever handled. My name is Detective Frank Dawson, badge number 2847, and I'm here to tell you about Sarah Chen, a young photography student whose disappearance would expose a labyrinth of digital stalking, obsessive surveillance, and premeditated murder that shook our California coastal town to its foundation. Sarah was known throughout the community college campus for her infectious laugh, her artistic eye, and her constant companion, a smartphone that contained thousands of photographs documenting every aspect of her daily life. When her roommate, Emma Rodriguez, called our department that Tuesday morning, her voice was trembling with panic. Sarah hadn't returned home for 2 nights, hadn't answered countless phone calls, and most disturbing of all, her usually active social media presence had gone completely silent. For a young woman who posted multiple times daily across various platforms, this digital silence was more alarming than any physical evidence of foul play. Emma met us at their shared apartment, a modest 2-bedroom unit in the Willowbrook complex, near campus. She was visibly shaking as she led us through the living room to Sarah's bedroom, explaining between sobs that Sarah had been acting increasingly paranoid over the past few weeks. She'd mentioned feeling watched during her daily routines, finding personal items moved in her room, and receiving strange messages that she'd tried to dismiss as pranks. We'd heard similar stories countless times before, usually attributing them to college stress, relationship drama, or simple paranoia. But something about Emma's demeanor and the specific details she provided told me this situation was fundamentally different. Sarah's bedroom was immaculate to an almost obsessive degree. Her bed was made with military precision, every book on her desk arranged in perfect order, and her photography equipment organized with the kind of attention to detail that suggested either extreme organization or recent tampering. But it was what we discovered on her nightstand that sent the first genuine chill down my spine. After nearly 2 decades of police work, her smartphone was there, plugged into its charger, completely intact and undamaged except for one crucial detail in today's hyper-connected world. A missing person leaving their phone behind is equivalent to leaving their soul behind, and Emma confirmed that Sarah never went anywhere without it, not even to the bathroom. As I carefully picked up the device, I immediately noticed something that would prove to be the first piece of a much larger puzzle. The screen was cracked in an intricate spider web pattern, as if it had been dropped or thrown with considerable force, yet it had been carefully placed on the charger afterward. When we powered on the device, what we discovered would become the cornerstone of our investigation and ultimately the key to solving Sarah's disappearance and bringing her killer to justice. Asterisk, the phone illuminated with Sarah's smiling face as the wallpaper, a selfie taken just days before her disappearance. But when we accessed her photo gallery through the standard interface, we encountered something that defied all logical explanation. Every single photograph had been systematically deleted. Thousands upon thousands of images accumulated over months of documenting her college experience, her photography assignments, her social gatherings, and her daily life, all completely wiped from existence. Her Instagram posts, her Snapchat memories, her camera roll that Emma described as being packed with pictures from her advanced photography classes, everything had been methodically erased. But here's where the case took its first truly bizarre turn, and why this investigation still haunts my dreams 5 years later, despite the comprehensive deletion. There was one photograph remaining, just one single image that someone had either accidentally overlooked or, more disturbingly, deliberately left behind as some kind of message. The surviving photograph showed Sarah sitting in what appeared to be a local coffee shop, captured in a candid moment as she worked on her laptop, completely unaware that she was being photographed. She wasn't alone in the frame. In the background, slightly out of focus, but clearly visible to anyone who knew what to look for, was a man in a dark hooded jacket. He was positioned strategically in such a way that he appeared to be watching her intently, his face partially obscured by the hood, but his body language suggesting focused surveillance. The timestamp embedded in the photo's metadata indicated It had been taken exactly 3 days before Sarah's disappearance. Emma had never seen this man before in any context, and Sarah had never mentioned feeling uncomfortable at any particular coffee establishment or encountering anyone who made her feel unsafe. In such a setting, we immediately began a systematic canvass of local cafes and coffee shops, starting with the establishments closest to the college campus and expanding outward in concentric circles. The third shop we visited, a popular student hangout called Brewhaven located just 2 blocks from campus, was where we encountered our first significant breakthrough. The manager, a 20-year-old college student named Jake Morrison, recognized Sarah immediately from the photograph we showed him. She was indeed a regular customer. He confirmed, typically arriving around 1 p.m. on weekdays to study for several hours. But what Jake told us next made my blood run cold and confirmed that we were dealing with something far more sinister than a simple missing person case. He noticed a man who seemed to appear whenever Sarah did, always ordering the same black coffee, always taking the same corner booth that provided an unobstructed view of Sarah's preferred table. Near the window, Jake had found the pattern odd enough to mention to his co-workers, but none of them had thought much of it until we showed him the surviving photograph. That was definitely the same guy, Jake confirmed with absolute certainty. Always wore that identical dark jacket, always kept his hood up regardless of the weather, and always maintained the same watching behavior that had made Jake increasingly uncomfortable. Over the past several weeks, Jake's detailed account painted a disturbing picture of systematic surveillance that had been ongoing for much longer than anyone had initially suspected. According to his observations, this hooded figure had been tracking Sarah's movements with the precision and dedication of a professional stalker. The coffee shop security cameras, which we immediately requested and obtained through expedited warrant, revealed a pattern that made my skin crawl with its methodical nature. For 3 consecutive weeks leading up to Sarah's disappearance, this mysterious figure had been arriving at Brewhaven approximately 10 minutes after Sarah, taking his usual corner booth and maintaining visual contact with her throughout the duration of her visits. The footage showed him occasionally pretending to read a book or work on a laptop, but his attention was consistently focused on Sarah's table. When Sarah packed up her belongings to leave, he would wait exactly 5 minutes before departing, always exiting through a different door to avoid any potential interaction. But the coffee shop was just the beginning of what we discovered was an extensive surveillance operation. We expanded our investigation to include other locations that Sarah frequented regularly, and the pattern continued with terrifying consistency. The campus library had captured footage of the same hooded figure browsing the stacks while Sarah studied, always maintaining sufficient distance to avoid detection but keeping her within sight. The grocery store, where Sarah worked part-time weekend shifts, had recorded him browsing the aisles during her work hours, sometimes spending over an hour in the store without making any purchases. Even more disturbing, we found security footage from the parking garage of Sarah's apartment complex showing a figure matching his exact description lurking near the stairwells on multiple occasions, always during times when Sarah would be coming or going. This wasn't random predatory behavior or opportunistic stalking. This was calculated, methodical surveillance that demonstrated intimate knowledge of Sarah's routines and suggested someone with considerable time, resources, and technical expertise. We brought in our digital forensics team, led by Officer Jonakim, to conduct a comprehensive examination of Sarah's phone. What they discovered was both technologically fascinating and absolutely terrifying from a criminal perspective. The device showed clear evidence of having been remotely accessed and manipulated by an unauthorized party. Someone with advanced technical skills had gained entry to her smartphone and systematically deleted her photographs, but in their haste to erase the digital evidence, they'd made one crucial oversight that would ultimately lead to their downfall. Officer Kim explained that the deletion pattern was far too uniform and comprehensive to be accidental or the result of a technical malfunction. This was deliberate data destruction, carried out by someone with considerable knowledge of smartphone operating systems and data recovery prevention techniques. But here's what really captured our attention and elevated this case to a new level of urgency. The phone's GPS history, while partially corrupted by the same person who deleted the photos, still contained fragments of location data from the day Sarah disappeared. Her last recorded location was the parking lot of Riverside Park, approximately 10 miles from her apartment complex and well outside her normal geographic routine. The timestamp indicated she'd been at that location at 11:30 p.m., which was well past her usual bedtime and completely inconsistent with her established patterns. Emma confirmed that Sarah never visited parks alone, especially not at night, and had never mentioned having any reason to go to Riverside Park specifically. Riverside Park sprawled across nearly 300 acres of dense woodland, hiking trails, and secluded picnic areas. If someone wanted to hide evidence of a crime, or worse, hide a victim, this location would provide countless opportunities for concealment. We organized a comprehensive search operation. At first light, bringing in K-9 units from 3 neighboring counties and assembling search teams to systematically cover the most remote and inaccessible areas of the park. The dogs picked up a scent trail almost immediately upon arriving at the main parking area, leading our teams deeper into the wilderness than most casual visitors would ever venture. Approximately half a mile from the main parking area, hidden behind a dense cluster of pine trees and completely invisible from any established trail, we discovered Sarah's car. The vehicle was locked, with no keys visible anywhere in the vicinity, but peering through the windows revealed immediate signs of a violent struggle. The driver's seat had been pushed back, much further than would be appropriate for someone of Sarah's petite stature. The rearview mirror was twisted at an odd angle, and there were what appeared to be scratch marks gouged into the plastic dashboard. The interior showed signs of disturbance, with Sarah's textbooks scattered across the floor and her purse contents spilled across the passenger seat. But it was what we found in the trunk that confirmed our worst fears and officially transformed this from a missing person investigation into a homicide case. Sarah's expensive camera equipment, the professional-grade gear she'd saved for months to purchase, was carefully arranged in the trunk along with her wallet, which still contained cash and credit cards. No one abandons that kind of valuable equipment voluntarily, and the careful arrangement suggested someone had deliberately placed these items there after the fact. The K-9 units led us another quarter-mile deeper into the woods, following a barely visible deer path to a natural ravine that was completely hidden from view. Unless you knew exactly where to look, that's where we found Sarah, and the scene that greeted us there will haunt me for the rest of my life. She was partially buried under a hastily assembled pile of leaves, branches, and debris, but the killer hadn't been thorough in their concealment efforts. Her body was in an advanced state of decomposition, but the coroner would later determine she'd been dead for approximately 48 hours, perfectly matching the timeline of her disappearance. The scene told a story of desperate violence and attempted escape. Sarah had clearly fought for her life with everything she had. There were extensive defensive wounds on her hands and arms, and the positioning of her body suggested she'd tried to crawl away from her attacker before succumbing to her injuries. But what struck me most profoundly was the deliberate nature of the concealment attempt. This wasn't a crime of passion followed by panic. This was premeditated murder followed by a calculated, if ultimately unsuccessful, cover-up attempt. We immediately secured the entire area and called in our crime scene investigation team to process every inch of the location while they meticulously documented the scene. I couldn't stop thinking about that single photograph left on Sarah's phone. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase her digital footprint, employing sophisticated technical knowledge to delete thousands of images. But they'd made one critical mistake. That oversight was going to be their undoing, and I was determined to make sure of it. Back at the station, our digital forensics team was working around the clock shifts to extract every possible piece of information from Sarah's smartphone and any associated cloud storage accounts. Officer Kim had managed to recover fragments of deleted data using advanced forensic software, and what she uncovered painted an increasingly disturbing picture of escalating harassment and surveillance that had been building for months. Text messages from multiple unknown phone numbers dating back approximately 6 months revealed a pattern of increasingly aggressive and invasive contact attempts. The messages had started innocuously enough, appearing to be compliments about Sarah's photography work that she regularly posted on her public social media accounts. However, they quickly escalated to include detailed descriptions of her daily routines, her class schedules, and even specific observations about her clothing choices on particular days. The sender clearly had intimate knowledge of Sarah's movements and activities, suggesting either physical surveillance or access to her digital communications. Sarah had systematically blocked each phone number as the messages became more inappropriate, but new numbers kept appearing with disturbing regularity. The messages became increasingly threatening over time, with the sender expressing growing anger about being ignored and making veiled threats about what might happen if Sarah continued to reject their advances. What was most chilling about these communications was the level of personal information the sender had accumulated. They knew her work schedule at the grocery store, her class timetable, her roommate's name and schedule, even details about her family back in Oregon. This degree of surveillance suggested someone with significant technical skills and possibly professional training in digital tracking and information gathering. We ran all the phone numbers through our database systems, but they consistently came back to prepaid burner phones purchased with cash from various locations throughout the county. However, our technical team was able to trace the digital fingerprints left behind by the unauthorized access to Sarah's phone. The intrusion had been carried out using sophisticated spyware, the type typically employed by private investigators, law enforcement agencies, or corporate security firms. This discovery significantly narrowed our suspect pool, as this level of technical expertise wasn't commonly available to the general public. We began conducting comprehensive background investigations into everyone in Sarah's life who might possess both the motive and the technical capability to carry out this level of surveillance. Her professors were interviewed and their background scrutinized. Her classmates were questioned about any unusual behavior they'd observed. Her co-workers at the grocery store were asked about customers who'd shown inappropriate interest in her, and even extended family members were contacted and cleared one by one. But it was Emma who provided the crucial breakthrough we desperately needed. During a follow-up interview, she mentioned that Sarah had been taking a computer security class as an elective requirement, and the instructor had been making her increasingly uncomfortable with his behavior. The professor's name was Marcus Webb, and according to Emma, Sarah had complained multiple times about Webb finding excuses to keep her after class, asking inappropriately personal questions about her photography work, and showing what she described as an unhealthy and unprofessional interest in her personal life and activities outside of school. Marcus Webb was 34 years old, unmarried, and had been teaching computer security and digital forensics at the community college for 3 years. On the surface, he appeared to be a model employee with consistently excellent student evaluations, a clean disciplinary record, and praise from his colleagues for his technical expertise and dedication to his students. But when we began digging deeper into his background, a much darker and more troubling picture began to emerge. Webb had previously worked for Sentinel Investigations, a private investigation firm specializing in digital surveillance, corporate espionage, and what they euphemistically called information recovery services. He'd been employed there for 2 years before being terminated under mysterious circumstances, with his former employer citing only vague policy violations and refusing to elaborate despite our official requests for information. We obtained a court order to access his employment records and discovered a disturbing pattern of inappropriate behavior toward female clients that had been carefully covered up by the company. Several women had filed formal complaints about Webb showing up at their homes uninvited, claiming to be conducting surveillance related to their cases, but actually engaging in what could only be described as stalking behavior. The investigation firm had quietly settled these complaints out of court with substantial financial payments and non-disclosure agreements, then terminated Webb's employment without reporting his behavior to any professional licensing boards or law enforcement agencies. But the most disturbing revelation came when we discovered that Webb had been systematically abusing his position at the college to gain unauthorized access to student records. Using his administrative privileges and technical expertise, he'd been accessing home addresses, phone numbers, class schedules, and even financial aid information for dozens of female students. He'd been methodically targeting young women in his classes, using his technical skills to monitor their digital activities and his position of authority to manipulate them into uncomfortable situations. Sarah wasn't his first victim. She was simply the first one who resisted his advances strongly enough to trigger his escalation to violence. We found evidence suggesting that at least 6 other female students had been subjected to similar harassment over the past 2 years. Most had quietly dropped his class or transferred to other institutions, attributing their discomfort to normal academic stress, rather than recognizing the systematic nature of his predatory behavior. Webb had been carefully selecting victims who were unlikely to report his conduct, often targeting students who were shy, socially isolated, struggling academically, or dealing with personal problems that made them vulnerable to manipulation. When we obtained a comprehensive search warrant for Webb's apartment, what we discovered was a shrine to obsession that defied belief. His home office contained multiple computer monitors displaying live social media feeds of various young women, including Sarah. Printed photographs covered an entire wall, images that had clearly been taken without the subject's knowledge or consent using telephoto lenses and surveillance techniques. There were detailed files on each woman, containing their daily routines, relationship status, family information, and personal details gathered through extensive digital stalking and real-world surveillance. Asterisk, the search of Webb's apartment yielded evidence that went far beyond what we'd expected to find. Hidden in a false bottom of his bedroom dresser drawer were Sarah's car keys, her smartphone SIM card, and most damning of all, a detailed journal documenting his escalating obsession with Sarah and his growing anger at her rejection of his advances. The journal entries, written in Webb's meticulous handwriting, provided a chilling window into the mind of a predator. The earliest entries, dating back nearly 8 months, described his initial attraction to Sarah when she enrolled in his computer security class. He wrote about her appearance, her personality, and what he interpreted as signs of romantic interest in their classroom interactions. As the entries progressed, it became clear that Webb had constructed an elaborate fantasy relationship in his mind, misinterpreting Sarah's normal student-teacher interactions as romantic signals. The journal documented his systematic surveillance of Sarah's activities, including detailed schedules of her movements, descriptions of her clothing, and even speculation about her personal relationships. He'd been photographing her without her knowledge for months, building an extensive collection of images that he'd organized by date and location. The entries revealed his growing frustration as Sarah failed to respond to what he perceived as his obvious romantic overtures. The final entry, dated the day before Sarah's murder, contained detailed plans for what Webb described as a confrontation at Riverside Park. He'd spent weeks studying Sarah's routines and had identified the park as an isolated location where he could approach her without witnesses. The entry described his intention to make Sarah understand his feelings and force her to acknowledge what he believed was their destined relationship. But the journal also revealed the depth of Webb's technical surveillance capabilities. He'd been using his computer expertise to monitor Sarah's digital communications, track her location through her smartphone, and even access her social media accounts without authorization. He'd installed spyware on her phone during a class session when she briefly left it unattended, giving him complete access to her messages, photos, and location data. The journal entries became increasingly erratic and violent as Sarah continued to ignore his advances and even began avoiding his class. Webb interpreted her absence as deliberate provocation and wrote extensively about his plans to teach her a lesson about rejecting someone who truly understood and appreciated her. The final entries contained explicit threats and detailed descriptions of what he planned to do to Sarah if she continued to ignore him. We now had overwhelming evidence linking Webb to Sarah's murder, but when we arrived at his apartment with an arrest warrant, we discovered that he'd fled. His car was missing from the parking lot, and neighbors reported seeing him loading boxes and suitcases into his vehicle the previous evening. Webb was on the run, but he'd made one crucial mistake that would ultimately lead to his capture. He'd kept Sarah's phone with him, and our technical team was actively tracking its signal as it moved across the state. Asterisk, the signal from Sarah's phone led us on a tense pursuit across 3 counties and to state lines. Webb was moving erratically, sometimes remaining stationary for hours at truck stops or rest areas, other times driving for extended periods without stopping. His movement pattern suggested someone in a state of panic, making impulsive decisions. Without any coherent escape plan, we coordinated with state police agencies, the FBI, and neighboring jurisdictions to establish roadblocks and monitor traffic cameras along major highways and interstate routes. Webb's vehicle, a dark blue Honda Accord that matched descriptions from multiple witnesses at the coffee shop and other surveillance locations, was spotted numerous times by traffic cameras and patrol units, but consistently managed to evade capture by taking unexpected route changes and avoiding main thoroughfares. The breakthrough in our manhunt came when the phone signal stopped moving and remained stationary for over 8 hours at a location approximately 200 miles from our jurisdiction. The signal was emanating from a small, rundown motel called the Desert Inn, the kind of establishment that still accepts cash payments and doesn't ask too many questions. about its guests' identities or backgrounds. We coordinated with the local sheriff's department and surrounded the motel at dawn, positioning officers at all possible exit points and establishing a secure perimeter. Webb was registered in room 137 under an obviously false name, and when we knocked on the door and identified ourselves as police officers, he initially tried to pretend the room was unoccupied. But when we announced that we were investigating Sarah Chen's murder and mentioned that we had evidence linking him to the crime, we heard frantic movement inside the room followed by the sound of furniture being moved against the door. What followed was a tense standoff that lasted nearly 6 hours and required the intervention of specialized negotiators and tactical teams. Webb had barricaded himself inside the motel room and was making increasingly desperate phone calls to local news stations, claiming he was being framed for a crime he didn't commit and demanding that his story be heard. Before he was arrested, through the thin motel room walls, we could hear him talking to himself, sometimes addressing Sarah as if she were still alive and present in the room with him. He alternated between denying any involvement in her death and making bizarre claims about their supposed romantic relationship. A police negotiator was brought in to establish communication, but Webb's mental state was clearly deteriorating. Rapidly, he claimed that Sarah had invited him to the park, that she wanted to be alone with him to discuss their relationship, and that her death had been a tragic accident during what he described as a romantic encounter gone wrong. These delusions were entirely consistent with the obsessive behavior documented in his journal and demonstrated a complete disconnect from reality. The standoff finally ended when Webb emerged from the room, but not in surrender as we'd hoped. He came out holding Sarah's phone above his head, threatening to destroy it if we didn't allow him to leave the area unharmed. What he didn't realize was that our digital forensics team had already extracted all the evidence we needed from the device's cloud backups and associated accounts. When he smashed the phone on the concrete parking lot, he was only destroying what had become the final piece of evidence that might have potentially helped his legal defense. Once Webb was in custody and transported back to our jurisdiction, his behavior became even more erratic and disturbing. During his initial interrogation sessions, he cycled through multiple contradictory versions of events, each more implausible and divorced from reality than the last. His first story involved complete denial of any involvement in Sarah's disappearance or death. He claimed he'd never met her personally, had no idea how her belongings ended up in his possession, and suggested that he was being framed by unknown enemies who wanted to destroy his career and reputation. When confronted with the overwhelming physical evidence from his apartment, including the photographs, surveillance equipment, and detailed journal entries, he switched to a second version that was equally unbelievable. Webb now claimed that Sarah had been stalking him, completely reversing the roles of victim and perpetrator. According to this fantasy, Sarah had become obsessed with him after taking his class and had been following him around, sending him unwanted messages, and trying to force a romantic relationship that he didn't want. He claimed that all the surveillance equipment and photographs were actually evidence he'd been gathering to prove Sarah's harassment of him. His third version was perhaps the most disturbing and demonstrated the complete extent of his delusions. Webb claimed that he and Sarah had been engaged in a secret romantic relationship for months, that she'd been sending him coded messages through her social media posts and photography assignments, and that their meeting at Riverside Park had been a planned romantic rendezvous. According to this elaborate fantasy, Sarah's death had been a tragic accident during what he described as passionate lovemaking that had somehow gone wrong. The forensic evidence, of course, told a completely different and much more violent story. Sarah's injuries were entirely consistent with a brutal assault, not a romantic encounter. The extensive defensive wounds on her hands and arms proved that she'd fought desperately for her life against an attacker. The positioning of her body and the evidence at the crime scene all pointed unambiguously to premeditated murder, not accidental death during consensual activity. What was most chilling about Webb's various confessions was his complete inability to accept responsibility for his actions or acknowledge the reality of what he'd done. Even when presented with overwhelming physical evidence, witness testimony, and his own written documentation of his plans, he continued to paint himself as either innocent or the victim of circumstances beyond his control. He claimed that Sarah had led him on by being friendly and polite in class, that her social media posts contained hidden messages meant specifically for him, and that her attempts to avoid him were just part of an elaborate game she was playing to increase his romantic interest. This level of delusion and reality distortion is unfortunately common in stalking cases that escalate to violence. The perpetrator becomes so completely invested in their fantasy relationship that they lose all connection to objective reality. In Webb's mind, Sarah's obvious fear and rejection weren't genuine emotions. They were just part of an elaborate romantic drama she was performing for his benefit. Her attempts to protect herself weren't reasonable responses to threatening behavior. They were signs that she was playing hard to get and wanted him to pursue her more aggressively. Webb's trial began 8 months after his arrest and would establish important legal precedents for the use of digital evidence in stalking and murder cases. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Lisa Martinez, built their case around the comprehensive electronic trail that Webb had left behind during his months of surveillance and harassment. Every deleted photograph, every spoofed text message, every piece of spyware found on Sarah's phone contributed to a narrative that painted Webb as a sophisticated predator who'd use his technical expertise to terrorize and ultimately murder an innocent young woman. The defense team, faced with overwhelming evidence of their client's guilt, attempted to argue that Webb suffered from severe mental illness that prevented him from understanding the nature and consequences of his actions. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about his delusional thinking patterns, his inability to distinguish between fantasy and reality, and his apparent belief that he'd been engaged in a consensual relationship with Sarah. While this testimony was compelling from a clinical perspective, it didn't change the fundamental fact that Webb had planned and executed Sarah's murder with considerable forethought and technical sophistication. The prosecution's key witness was Officer Jana Kim, our digital forensics expert, who spent 3 days walking the jury through the technical evidence step by step. She explained in detail how Webb had used his computer skills to monitor Sarah's activities, how he'd gained unauthorized access to her smartphone and social media accounts, and how he'd attempted to cover up his crimes by systematically deleting evidence. The timeline she presented showed months of escalating surveillance and harassment leading directly to Sarah's murder, demonstrating clear premeditation and intent. Sarah's roommate Emma provided emotionally devastating testimony about the fear and paranoia Sarah had expressed during her final weeks. She described how Sarah had become increasingly anxious about being watched, how she'd started checking locks multiple times, and varying her daily routines in an attempt to feel safer. Emma's testimony painted a picture of a young woman who had sensed the danger surrounding her, but hadn't known how to identify or protect herself from a threat that remained largely invisible until it was too late. The most powerful moment in the entire trial came when the prosecution displayed the single photograph that had survived Webb's deletion attempt. Projected on a large screen for the jury to see, the image showed Sarah sitting peacefully in the coffee shop, completely unaware that her future killer was watching and photographing her from across the room. The contrast between her innocent, relaxed expression and the hooded figure lurking menacingly in the background was stark and haunting, providing a visual representation of the predatory relationship that had ultimately led to her death. Webb's journal entries were read aloud in court, providing the jury with a chilling glimpse into the mind of an obsessed stalker. The progression from initial attraction to romantic fantasy to violent rage was clearly documented in his own handwriting. When the final entry was read, describing his detailed plans to teach Sarah a lesson at Riverside Park, several jury members visibly recoiled, and one had to excuse herself from the courtroom. The defense's attempts to portray Webb as mentally ill were significantly undermined by the methodical nature of his planning and his sophisticated attempts to cover up the crime, which demonstrated clear awareness of wrongdoing and consequences. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: first-degree murder with special circumstances, aggravated stalking, criminal harassment, illegal surveillance, and computer crimes. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence against Webb and the clarity of the prosecution's case. During the penalty phase of the trial, Sarah's family was finally given the opportunity to speak about their devastating loss and its impact on their lives. Sarah's parents, David and Linda Chen, had flown in from Portland, Oregon, and their victim impact statements provided heartbreaking insight into the vibrant life that had been cut short by Webb's obsession. They described a daughter who'd been full of dreams and ambitions, whose artistic talent and compassionate nature had touched everyone who knew her. Sarah's mother spoke through tears about the photographs Sarah used to send home regularly, documenting her college experiences, her growing skills as a photographer, and her excitement about her future career plans. The cruel irony that Webb had tried to erase these precious digital memories wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. Her father talked about the safety measures they'd taught Sarah throughout her life, the self-defense classes she'd taken, the warnings about stranger danger they'd emphasized, but noted that no parent thinks to prepare their child for the threat that might come from within their own classroom, from someone in a position of trust and authority. The victim impact statements from Sarah's classmates and friends revealed the broader impact of Webb's crimes on the entire college community. Several young women testified about their own experiences with his inappropriate behavior, describing a pattern of boundary violations and uncomfortable interactions that had escalated over time. Their testimony demonstrated that Sarah's murder wasn't an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of years of predatory behavior that had been allowed to continue unchecked. Webb was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional consecutive sentences for the stalking and computer crimes. As Judge Patricia Hernandez read the sentence, Webb showed no visible emotion, staring straight ahead as if the proceedings were happening to someone else. Even at this final moment, he seemed unable or unwilling to grasp the reality of what he'd done or accept responsibility for his actions. Judge Hernandez's closing remarks focused specifically on the technological aspects of the case, noting that Webb had used his considerable computer skills not to benefit society or advance human knowledge, but to terrorize and ultimately murder an innocent young woman. She warned that as technology continues to advance and become more integrated into our daily lives, law enforcement and the justice system must remain vigilant against those who would exploit these powerful tools for criminal purposes. After the sentencing, I had the opportunity to speak with Sarah's parents outside the courthouse. They thanked our department for the thoroughness of our investigation and the dedication we'd shown to finding justice for their daughter. However, their gratitude was inevitably tinged with the permanent sadness and sense of loss that no conviction could ever heal. No amount of justice could bring Sarah back or restore the future that had been stolen from her and from them. Sarah's murder prompted significant and lasting changes in how our department approaches stalking cases, digital evidence collection, and the intersection of technology and criminal behavior. We implemented comprehensive new training programs for all officers on recognizing the warning signs of cyber stalking, established protocols for rapidly accessing and preserving digital evidence in missing person cases, and created partnerships with technology companies to improve our investigative capabilities. The community college where Webb had taught also underwent major reforms in response to the case. Background check procedures were significantly strengthened, with particular attention paid to previous employment terminations and any history of inappropriate behavior toward women. New policies were implemented to monitor faculty interactions with students more closely, and reporting mechanisms were established to make it easier for students to report uncomfortable or inappropriate behavior without fear of academic retaliation. The computer lab, where Webb had conducted much of his surveillance activities, was completely restructured with new security measures, oversight protocols, and access controls to prevent similar abuses in the future. Perhaps the most important long-term impact of Sarah's case was the increased public awareness it generated about the dangers of digital stalking and the importance of taking online harassment seriously. Sarah's story became a cautionary tale that was shared in schools, community centers, and online safety workshops throughout the region. Local high schools and colleges began including comprehensive digital safety curricula in their programs, teaching students how to recognize the warning signs of cyber stalking, protect their personal information online, and report suspicious or threatening behavior to appropriate authorities. The single photograph that had survived Webb's deletion attempt became a powerful symbol of how technology can serve as both a tool for predators and a means of bringing them to justice. Our digital forensics unit began using Sarah's case as a primary training example in law enforcement conferences and educational programs, demonstrating how even sophisticated attempts to destroy digital evidence often leave recoverable traces that can be crucial to solving crimes. Officer Jana Kim, who'd been instrumental in extracting and analyzing the digital evidence, was promoted to head our newly expanded cybercrimes unit. She now regularly speaks at national conferences about the Sarah Chen case, emphasizing the critical importance of preserving digital evidence, and the ongoing need for law enforcement agencies to stay current with rapidly evolving technology and criminal methodologies. The case also highlighted significant gaps in mental health resources and intervention programs for individuals showing signs of obsessive or stalking behavior. While Webb's actions were ultimately his own responsibility and choice, earlier intervention and treatment might have prevented Sarah's death and protected other potential victims. Several local mental health organizations used the case to advocate for increased funding and improved access to treatment programs for individuals struggling with obsessive behaviors and unhealthy relationship patterns. Asterisk, the impact of Sarah's murder extended far beyond our immediate community and jurisdiction, generating national attention and influencing law enforcement practices across the country. The case was extensively studied by FBI behavioral analysts and incorporated into training programs for local police departments nationwide, as an example of how traditional stalking behaviors had evolved and adapted to the digital age. Federal law enforcement agencies began using Webb's methods and investigative techniques we developed as training materials for their own cybercrimes units. The case also sparked significant legislative action at both state and federal levels. Our state legislature passed comprehensive new laws strengthening penalties for cyber stalking, requiring educational institutions to implement stricter monitoring and reporting systems for faculty-student interactions, and mandating that colleges and universities provide digital safety training for all students, faculty, and staff members. The Sarah Chan Act, as the legislation became known, also established new funding streams for law enforcement training in digital forensics and cybercrime investigation techniques. For me personally, Sarah's case fundamentally changed how I approach every investigation involving technology and digital evidence. I learned that in our increasingly interconnected world, digital evidence often provides a more complete and accurate picture of criminal behavior than traditional physical evidence alone. Every smartphone, every computer, every internet-connected device has the potential to serve as a silent witness to crimes, storing data that can either convict the guilty or exonerate the innocent. The case also reinforced the critical importance of taking stalking seriously, regardless of whether it occurs through traditional in-person methods or through digital channels. Too often, victims are advised to simply block their harassers, change their phone numbers, or modify their social media privacy settings. But as Sarah's case demonstrated, determined stalkers with technical expertise will find ways around these basic protective measures. Law enforcement must be prepared to investigate these crimes with the same intensity, resources, and expertise that we bring to other serious violent offenses. I still think about Sarah frequently, particularly when working on cases involving young victims or digital evidence. Her photograph, the single image that survived Webb's deletion attempt, remains displayed in our department's cybercrimes unit as a constant reminder of why we do this work and the importance of staying vigilant against those who would exploit technology for criminal purposes. Every case we solve, every predator we apprehend, every victim we help represents a step toward preventing another family from experiencing the devastating loss that Sarah's parents continue to endure. The coffee shop where Sarah used to study has become an unofficial memorial, a gathering place for photography students and digital safety advocates. Her favorite table near the window has a small commemorative plaque with her name and a brief message about digital safety awareness. Photography students from the college often gather there to share their work, discuss their projects, and remember a classmate and fellow artist they never had the opportunity to know personally. Jake Morrison, the manager who first noticed Webb's suspicious behavior and provided crucial early testimony, became an advocate for training service industry workers to recognize and report potential stalking behavior to law enforcement. The Sarah Chen case marked a significant turning point in how our department and law enforcement agencies nationwide utilize technology in criminal investigations. The success we achieved in recovering deleted data, tracing digital footprints, and building a comprehensive case based largely on electronic evidence led to increased funding for our cybercrimes unit, advanced training opportunities for all detectives, and the acquisition of cutting-edge forensic equipment that has proven invaluable in subsequent investigations. We now have the technological capability and expertise to handle complex digital evidence that would have been completely beyond our reach just a few years ago. The case also highlighted the paradoxical nature of modern technology in criminal justice. While Webb used sophisticated digital tools to stalk, monitor, and ultimately murder Sarah. Those same technologies ultimately provided the evidence needed to convict him and ensure justice was served. His attempts to cover his tracks through systematic digital deletion actually created additional evidence, as the deletion patterns themselves told a story of guilt, premeditation, and consciousness of wrongdoing. Officer Kim often reflects on how the case changed her perspective on digital forensics and the role of technology in modern criminal investigations. She notes that every piece of technology we use in our daily lives creates detailed records of our activities. And while this reality raises legitimate concerns about privacy and surveillance, it also means that criminals can no longer simply destroy physical evidence and expect to escape justice. The digital realm has an almost perfect memory, and skilled investigators can often recover information that perpetrators believe they've permanently erased. The case has been featured extensively in law enforcement training programs, academic conferences, and criminology research studies focused on cyberstalking and technology-facilitated violence. Students studying criminal justice and digital forensics examine Webb's escalation pattern as a textbook example of how online harassment and surveillance can progress to real-world violence. The detailed digital trail he left behind provides researchers and law enforcement professionals with unprecedented insight into the mind and methods of a technologically sophisticated stalker. Sarah's case also influenced policy changes at major social media companies and technology platforms. Several companies cited the case when implementing new policies and technical measures for dealing with persistent harassment, stalking behavior, and unauthorized access to user accounts. While these changes came too late to help Sarah, they have potentially prevented countless other individuals from experiencing similar ordeals and provided better tools for victims to protect themselves and seek help. The legal precedents established by Webb's conviction have been cited in numerous subsequent cases involving digital stalking, cyber harassment, and technology-facilitated violence. Prosecutors across the country now have a proven roadmap for building cases based on electronic evidence, and defense attorneys can no longer easily dismiss digital evidence as unreliable, circumstantial, or technically flawed. For the Chen family, learning about the technological aspects of Webb's crimes provided both a sense of closure and additional layers of pain and violation. While they were grateful that the digital evidence led to his conviction and ensured that justice was served, discovering the full extent of his surveillance and monitoring of their daughter was deeply disturbing and traumatic. Knowing that Sarah's final weeks and months had been spent under constant, invisible observation by her future killer added another dimension of tragedy to their already devastating loss. After 7 years have passed since Sarah Chen's murder, and her case continues to influence how law enforcement agencies investigate crimes. In our increasingly digital world, the investigative techniques we developed and refined while working her case have been applied to hundreds of subsequent investigations, helping us solve crimes that might have remained unsolved. In an earlier era, the single photograph that survived Webb's deletion attempt has become an iconic piece of evidence in law enforcement training programs worldwide, demonstrating how even the smallest oversight by a perpetrator can ultimately lead to justice for victims and their families. Sarah's legacy extends far beyond the criminal justice system and continues to impact lives in positive ways throughout our community and beyond. The scholarship established in her name has now helped 23 young photographers pursue their education and develop their artistic talents. Many of these scholarship recipients have gone on to successful careers in photography, journalism, and digital media, carrying forward the creative spirit that Sarah embodied. The college's photography department maintains a permanent memorial gallery displaying some of Sarah's recovered work, ensuring that her artistic vision continues to inspire new generations of students and artists. Her parents, David and Linda Chen, visit our community every year on the anniversary of Sarah's death, not only to remember and honor their daughter, but also to speak at schools, community centers, and law enforcement conferences about digital safety, the warning signs of stalking behavior, and the importance of taking online harassment seriously. Their presentations have reached thousands of young people over the years, potentially saving lives by educating them about dangers that Sarah never had the opportunity to learn about or protect herself against. The coffee shop where Sarah spent countless hours studying and working on her photography assignments has evolved into much more than just a memorial site. Brew Haven has become a gathering place for photography students, digital safety advocates, and community members committed to preventing similar tragedies. The staff receive regular training on recognizing suspicious behavior, and the shop has become a model for how businesses can help protect their customers from predators while maintaining a welcoming and comfortable environment. Jake Morrison, the manager who first noticed Webb's stalking behavior and provided crucial early testimony, now works directly with our department to train other business owners and employees on recognizing and reporting suspicious activities that might indicate stalking or other criminal behavior. For me personally, as I approach retirement after 32 years in law enforcement, Sarah's case stands out as one of the most significant and impactful investigations of my entire career, not because it was the most complex or high-profile case I've worked, but because it demonstrated how quickly and completely a promising young life can be destroyed by someone's twisted fantasies and obsessions, and how technology has fundamentally changed the nature of both criminal behavior and criminal investigation. The case reinforced my belief that no matter how sophisticated criminals become in their use of technology, dedicated investigators armed with the right tools, training, and determination can always find ways to hold them accountable for their actions. Webb's conviction brought a measure of justice for Sarah and her family, but it could never bring her back or heal the permanent wounds left by her loss. Her case serves as a constant reminder that behind every crime statistic is a real person, with dreams, hopes, relationships, and people who love them deeply. Sarah Chan was much more than just a victim of violence. She was a talented, creative young woman with unlimited potential whose life was cut tragically short by a predator's obsession and sense of entitlement. The single photograph that survived Webb's systematic attempt to erase Sarah's digital existence serves as a powerful metaphor for the resilience of truth and the importance of thorough, dedicated investigation. In that image, we see both the vulnerability of a young woman completely unaware of the danger watching her, and the evidence that would ultimately bring her killer to justice and ensure that he could never harm anyone else. Sarah Chan's story is undeniably a tragedy that should never have happened, but it's also a testament to the power of meticulous investigation, advanced forensic techniques, and the unwavering determination of those who refuse to let victims be forgotten or their killers escape justice. Her case changed how we approach digital evidence, influenced legislation protecting potential stalking victims, educated countless people about online safety, and continues to serve as a reminder of both the dangers and the investigative opportunities present in our connected world. Most importantly, it ensures that Sarah's memory lives on, not just as a cautionary tale about the dark side of technology, but as an inspiration to those who continue the fight for justice in an increasingly complex digital age, and as a celebration of the creative spirit and bright future that was stolen from her and her family.